The hand came out of nowhere. That is what the people closest to Table 7 would later say, in the particular way of witnesses who had not been paying attention and were now reconstructing the moment in reverse. That 1 second Richard Holt was speaking, too loud, too certain, the way men like him always spoke in rooms like this, and the next his open palm had crossed the distance between them and connected with the side of the tall man's face. Not a closed fist. Not a deliberate strike exactly, the way violence sometimes is deliberate. More the kind of gesture a man makes when he has lived his entire life without once considering the consequences of his own hands. A dismissal, a correction, an administrative action made physical. The sound it made was flat and clean, the way sounds are in high-ceilinged rooms with good acoustics and thick tablecloths and a string quartet in the east corner who kept playing for exactly 2 more beats before the violinist's bow went still. The tall man did not move. That was the thing people would carry home with them after. Not the sound, not the way the gold cufflink on Richard Holt's wrist had caught the chandelier light as his arm came down. Not the faces at the surrounding tables, the dropped forks, the half-raised glasses. What they would carry was the stillness. The 6'4", 240-pound man standing in his dusty work boots and his canvas jacket, and the absolute unnerving architectural stillness of him. Not a flinch, not a step back. Not even a tightening of the jaw that would have been visible from across the room. Just that stillness, the specific stillness of a wall that has been asked to apologize for being a wall and has simply declined. His daughter was standing beside him. She was 8 years old, and she was wearing a blue dress with white buttons that her grandmother had bought her for Easter, and she was holding a small paper cup of orange juice in both hands. When the sound happened, the cup crinkled very slightly in her grip. That was all. She looked up at her father's face. He was looking at Richard Holt. Lily Webb did not look at Richard Holt. She looked only at her father, and then very carefully she moved 1 inch closer to him and her shoulder pressed against the side of his thigh. Nobody in that room was watching the small woman standing near the window. That was their first mistake. She was already putting her notebook in her pocket. She was already turning around. And she was already walking. If this is the kind of story you need right now, subscribe. There's more coming. Marcus Webb had left the Chandler Street site at 4:45 that afternoon, which was already 40 minutes later than he had planned, which meant he'd had exactly 12 minutes to get across the city to the school, which meant the crossing guard at Lily's school had watched him jog across the parking lot with something between amusement and mild professional concern. "You're the dad who runs," she'd said. "I'm always the dad who runs," he'd replied. And Lily had come out through the double doors with her backpack on both shoulders and her lunchbox in her left hand, and she had looked at him the way she always looked at him when he was late. Not annoyed, exactly. More like she had already made her peace with it before it happened, which was a quality that sometimes made Marcus wonder which of the 2 of them was actually the parent. He had not changed clothes. He knew he should have. The invitation had been clear enough. Business formal, it had said, printed on cardstock that probably cost more per sheet than his first paycheck. He had known since Thursday that he would be standing in a hotel ballroom that evening while someone read his name into a microphone and presented him with an award he had not asked for and still was not entirely sure how to feel about receiving. He had a dark suit hanging on the back of his office door. His good shoes were in a bag on the rear seat of the truck. There had been a plan. A specific and workable plan that accounted for traffic and for Lily's tendency to want to stop at the water fountain at school and for the parking situation at the Meridian Hotel on a Friday evening. The plan had dissolved at 3:15. The foreman at Chandler Street had found a load-bearing discrepancy in the east wall of Building C, and he had called Marcus not because Marcus needed to be there were structural engineers on site, but because the foreman, whose name was Terrell and who had worked with Marcus for 11 years, had understood that certain decisions required Marcus's eyes specifically. Marcus's eyes had been looking at walls for 23 years. They could see things in concrete and rebar and load distribution that other people's eyes passed over, not because other people were incompetent, but because some knowledge does not come from schooling. It comes from time, and from attention, and from 23 years of caring, specifically about whether the things you build will be standing in 40 years. So he had been on the Chandler Street site until 4:45, in his canvas work pants and his steel-toed boots and the jacket with the Webb Construction Group logo on the left chest and a hard hat clip mark on his forehead that had not fully faded by the time he got to the school. And by the time he and Lily had made it through traffic and into the parking structure of the Meridian Hotel and through the lobby and to the ballroom entrance, there was no longer time to find the lobby bathroom and change into the dark suit, because Lily had spotted the dessert table near the registration and Marcus had discovered, as he had discovered many times in the 8 years since Lily had entered his life, that certain battles had already been lost before they started. The young woman at the ballroom entrance, Sandra, her badge said, event coordinator, had looked at him the way people looked at very large black men in canvas work jackets who appeared at the entrances to hotel galas. Not with hostility, with something more complicated than that, something Marcus had learned to read over the years the way you learn to read weather, not anger exactly, but a kind of professional confusion, the expression of a person whose mental filing system had encountered a document that did not fit any existing category. She had asked if he was with the catering staff. He had told her his name. She had looked at her list, looked at him, looked at her list again, and then produced a smile that suggested the name on the list and the man in front of her were two different genres of thing that her brain was having difficulty shelving together. Of course she'd said, "Right this way." He had followed her in. Lily's hand found his. He took it without looking down. He had been moving through this particular gap, the gap between what people expected and what was true, for the entirety of his adult life. He had learned to move through it without friction, the way a river learns the shape of stone, not because the stone was right to be there, not because the stone deserved accommodation, but because the river had somewhere to be, and the stone was not worth the kind of energy that detours required. Energy that Marcus had long ago decided could be better spent on the buildings. He did what he always did when he entered a new room. He looked up, not at the chandeliers, at the ceiling, at the long steel spans concealed inside the Meridian Ballroom's plaster finish, at the way the weight of everything above was being quietly distributed through the building's bones. 46 feet of span across the main floor, 3 concealed I-beams doing the real work, a renovation somewhere around 2010 visible in the join between the original plaster and the new recessed lighting. A good join, but not a perfect one. The kind that a building inspector would pass and a builder would notice. He noticed these things the way other people notice the temperature in a room, automatically, without deciding to. The way a person trained to read structures reads them even when they are trying not to. He looked at the ceiling for about 4 seconds. Then he looked at Lily. She was already 4 steps ahead of him, moving toward the bar. Claire Song had arrived at the Meridian Hotel at 2 in the afternoon. This was not unusual. She arrived early to everything, but to events she had built herself, she arrived very early, because the kinds of problems that surface in the first hour before a large event are different from the kinds that surface during it, and Claire had learned across 11 years that she would rather know about them at 2 than at 7. The Horizon Housing Foundation Gala was, technically, her event. The foundation was her organization. She had founded it with her own money, and with a specific kind of anger, which she had long since refined into something more precise and more lasting. Not anger exactly, determination with very good memory. She was wearing dark trousers and a slate gray blazer. Her hair was back. She wore a single silver ring on her right hand, given to her by a mentor 20 years ago, the mentor who had told her that the people who changed cities did it quietly. Claire had taken this to mean something about architecture and about how buildings outlast the arguments people have about them, and she still thought about it sometimes, in rooms that were too loud. The event coordinator, Sandra, same young woman who would later look at Marcus's badge in mild confusion, had asked if Claire needed help finding the main event. "I'm in the right place," Claire had said. Sandra had looked at the founder badge in Claire's hand and her expression had moved through several things in quick succession. Confusion, recalibration, a flash of embarrassment, before settling into something warm and overcorrective. "Of course. I'm so sorry." "You don't have to be," Claire had said, and she had meant it simply, without the generosity that people sometimes attach to phrases like that. She was 4 feet 10, she had achondroplasia. She had been the smallest person in every room she had ever entered since the day she was born. Her mother said she'd even been the smallest in the delivery room, which was a joke, but the kind of joke that only works because it is also true, and the being mistaken had been happening for so long that it had undergone a kind of transformation in her, from something that stung to something that was simply data. She collected it. She had been collecting it all evening. The notebook was small and dark green, worn at the corners from 3 years of handling, soft in the way that things get when they have been in someone's pocket every day for a long time. She wrote in it in a small, extremely precise hand, not sentences most of the time, more like coordinates. A board member's name beside a donor's name beside a number. The angle of a conversation, the particular quality of attention that a certain city council member had been paying to a certain foundation staffer all evening, who had arrived early, who had not arrived at all. What the placement of the floral arrangement near the east wall suggested about the hotel's event manager's theory of how much a nonprofit could be upsold. She had been moving through the room since the doors opened at 6, notebook open, water glass in hand, watching. She was near the window when the truck drove past outside. She could not have seen it from there, but she looked up anyway, and when she looked back across the room, the man in the canvas jacket was coming through the main doors with a little girl in a blue dress and white buttons, and the little girl was already scanning the dessert table with the dedicated focus of a person who had priorities. Claire wrote 2 things in her notebook: Webb, Lily. Then she closed the notebook and put it in her pocket, and she did not look at anything else in the room. Richard Holt had been donating to the Horizon Housing Foundation for 4 years, which was long enough that he had begun to think of it, in a comfortable background way, as his. Not his. He would not have said that. He would have said he was passionate about the cause, that affordable housing was a crisis of moral dimension that required people with resources and vision to step up and take action, and he believed these things, genuinely, in the way that comfortable men believe in causes that do not require them to change anything about their lives. He had given $750,000 over 4 years, which was not nothing, and he knew that number the way he knew the square footage of his apartment in the city and his house in the country, which is to say he held it with a particular and unconscious satisfaction that had nothing to do with what the number had actually built. He was 61. He had built Holt Financial Partners from a single-floor office in the financial district to a firm managing $4.3 billion in assets. He had done this through intelligence and opportunism, and through a specific variety of certainty that had been present in him for so long it had become indistinguishable from personality. He walked into rooms the way the rooms had been arranged for him. He spoke the way men speak when they have spent 6 decades in rooms that rearrange themselves around them. He was not cruel. This is important to say clearly because what comes next is easier to dismiss if he is simply cruel. He was not. He was a man who had developed, through no single deliberate choice but through the accumulation of 1,000 small reinforced habits, a complete inability to imagine that any room he entered had not been built for his benefit. He had been at his table since 7. He had drunk enough that the certainty which lived in him ordinarily had expanded, taken up more space, become more natural feeling, more justified. He had given a reasonable speech during the program and had laughed the right number of times and had written a note in his phone to have his assistant follow up about the tax paperwork. He had been managing the room the way he always managed rooms, with a loose and proprietary attention, and what he noticed near the bar at 7:45 was a very large man in a work jacket with a logo on it and boots that had concrete dust on them, standing next to a little girl, apparently ordering a drink, apparently entirely comfortable, apparently unaware that comfortable was not the category available to him in this particular room on this particular evening. Richard Holt managed things. It was the central fact of his career and possibly of his personality. He saw things that needed managing, and he managed them. He pushed back his chair. Marcus was asking for orange juice. For Lily, specifically, she had a specific preference for pulp-free, and she had been known to articulate this preference to bartenders at some length. When he felt, without seeing it, the approach. He had spent 20 years on construction sites, which are among the loudest and most physically complex environments a person can inhabit, and he had developed in those years a kind of peripheral awareness that had nothing to do with looking. He felt the approach the way a building feels weather before the weather arrives. He did not turn around. He waited. "Excuse me." The voice was the voice of a man who has spent 60 years saying those words and has never once meant them as a request for anything. Marcus turned. The man behind him was in his early 60s, with the particular redness in the face and neck that comes from a combination of confidence and an evening of alcohol and a body that has not worked hard in a long time. The suit was expensive. Marcus knew clothes the way he knew buildings by the work in them, but it fit him the way expensive suits fit men who used to be thinner. He was looking at Marcus with an expression Marcus had seen on men like this before, many times in many rooms. Not precisely anger, more the expression of a person who has encountered something in the wrong place, a file in the wrong folder, and is about to correct it. "The service entrance," the man said, "is on 43rd Street, around the back." Lily's hand, which had been reaching with great determination for the orange juice the bartender had just placed on the counter, went absolutely still. Marcus looked at the man. He simply looked at him. He had a gift for this, for a silence that was not empty, that had weight and dimension, that communicated something clear without the expenditure of language. He had not been born with this gift. It had come to him over years, over the slow accumulation of moments like this one, over the understanding that structures that announced themselves were rarely the strongest ones. The strongest ones did not need to announce anything. "I'm a guest," Marcus said. 2 words. Level. Without inflection of any kind. The man, Richard, though Marcus did not yet know this, found this response specifically offensive. Not the words, the delivery. The absence of apology in it, the absence of the particular downward adjustment that this kind of interaction usually produced. The thing Richard Holt had unconsciously been waiting for and had not received. "I don't think so," Richard said. He raised his voice slightly. Not to a shout. Men like him did not shout in hotel ballrooms. They simply expanded the volume, made the statement larger, more public, more unarguable. "I don't think you belong here." The bartender found something important to look at on the counter below. 2 people at the nearest table turned. Lily had the orange juice now, both small hands around the paper cup. She had gone completely still, in the way children go still when they are watching something that is important to understand. "My name is on the guest list," Marcus said. Marcus Webb. The name passed across Richard Holt's face and left no visible mark. Names without context do not mean much to men who operate primarily in their own context. Marcus Webb could have been anyone. Marcus Webb, to Richard Holt, was still wearing work boots. He called for security. The security guard who came was a young man named Darius who had worked Meridian events for 3 years and had seen versions of this before. He had the expression of a man walking toward something he had already fully assessed and already did not want any part of. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the badge clipped to the left chest of the canvas jacket, the white and blue guest badge with the Foundation's logo, the one Sandra had given him at the door. He looked at Richard Holt. He started to say something. Richard Holt was already moving. He stepped between Darius and Marcus. His voice was louder now, not a shout still, but past the threshold of what was appropriate in a room of this kind, and people were turning, chairs scraping, and his arm was moving, gesturing toward the jacket, toward the boots, toward the invisible direction of the service entrance. Large declarative gestures that said without words that this situation had already been evaluated and found lacking. And then his arm came down in the gesture that was not quite intentional and not quite not, the flat of his palm moving across the distance between them, connecting. The sound was flat and clean. Lily's cup crinkled in both her hands. Marcus did not move. He breathed. He was looking at Richard Holt with the same expression he had been wearing since he turned around, which was no particular expression, which was simply the face he had when he was present in a situation and choosing what to do next. And the choice he had made, as he had made it every time in every room across every year, was stillness. It was not fear, it was not compliance, it was not even patience, exactly. It was something more difficult to name. The decision of a man who understood, at a very deep level, that the way you respond to disrespect is a statement about what you value more than the disrespect itself is. And what Marcus Webb valued was not giving Richard Holt the satisfaction of a reaction, What Marcus Webb valued was his daughter standing beside him, watching. Nobody in that room was watching the small woman. She was already there. She did not run. She did not raise her voice before she arrived. She moved across the ballroom floor the way she always moved through spaces, which was with an absolute lack of hurry that somehow also managed to be an absolute lack of hesitation, the two things that seem contradictory until you understand that what she had was not speed but intention. And intention, in a space like that, had a way of parting crowds. People stepped aside. A waiter adjusted his path. A woman at a table between the window and the bar moved her chair slightly, almost without realizing she had done it. Claire Song stopped 3 feet from Richard Holt. He turned. He looked down. She was 4 feet 10, and he was looking down at her from the particular height of a man who was used to looking down at things, and then he smiled. Not a malicious smile, a tolerant one. The smile he gave to things he found non-threatening and perhaps slightly charming in a way that had nothing to do with taking them seriously. "And who are you?" he said. She said nothing for exactly 1 second. It was not hesitation. Anyone who had watched her that evening, watched the way she moved through conversations, always listening more than she spoke, always giving that precise beat of quiet before she answered. A beat that was not emptiness but calibration, the moment of calculating exactly what a situation required, would have recognized it. Richard Holt had not watched her that evening. "I'm the woman," Claire said, "who'd like to hear you explain what you just did." Her voice was the most surprising thing about her, to people who heard it for the first time. Not loud, not sharp, simply clear. Clear in the specific way of a line drawn by a person who draws for precision, no unnecessary marks, nothing wasted. The kind of clarity that has nothing to do with volume and everything to do with knowing exactly what you mean. Richard Holt laughed, a short laugh, self-aware, performing reasonableness for the room. He looked around at the people who had turned, at Darius, at the tables of guests who had gone still, and he was still smiling, still managing, still finding the angle that made this manageable. "This gentleman," he began. "This man," she said. She did not raise her voice. She simply put the 2 words exactly where they needed to go, the way a good builder places a beam, not loudly but precisely, so that what stands on top of it is supported. Richard looked at her again. A different kind of look this time, not the tolerant one, something more careful. He had been in rooms for 60 years, and he had learned to read certain things, and what he was beginning to read in this particular small woman in the gray blazer with her hands loose at her sides was something he did not have immediate access to a word for. A quality of not moving. Not the stillness of someone who was uncertain. The stillness of something that was not going to move. "The foundation," he said, recovering himself, taking the larger posture, the voice dropping back into reasonable register, "has certain standards for events of this—" "For guests?" she said. "For events of this kind." He gestured broadly at the room. "This is a formal occasion." He gestured at Marcus, carefully, directing attention toward the jacket, the boots, the all of it. "This individual doesn't appear to have—" "A badge?" said Darius, and he was holding it up, and his voice was very neutral, and the badge was clearly readable from where Richard Holt was standing. The badge with guest on it in clean blue letters. The badge with the foundation logo on it. The foundation whose name was on the invitation in Richard Holt's jacket pocket. The silence that landed in the room was the kind that has physical weight. People at 3 different tables had stopped talking. The string quartet was still quiet. Someone near the dessert table, a woman in her 40s who had seen the whole thing from the beginning, had her hand over her mouth. Richard Holt's jaw moved. "Even so," he said, "because men like this do not stop easily, the machinery of their certainty running on long past the moment when fuel has run out, there are standards, and this kind of—" "Mr. Holt," the voice came from across the room. Calm, carrying. The voice of a woman who had been watching for 4 minutes and had arrived at a decision. "Dr. Patricia Osei was the board chair of the Horizon Housing Foundation, 53 years old, silver-haired, with the posture of someone who has spent 30 years in a field that required her to walk into difficult rooms and stay. She crossed the room without hurrying, and she stopped beside Claire Song, and she looked at Richard Holt with an expression that was not unkind and was also absolutely clear. 'Do you know who you're speaking to?' she asked. He looked at the small woman beside her. He looked the way he had been looking at things all evening, with the loose proprietary attention of a man assessing his own inventory. I don't, actually. This, said Patricia Osei, is Dr. Claire Song. She founded this organization. She is the primary architect of its funding structure. She has been the lead financial supporter of this foundation since the year it opened its doors. Every event this organization has hosted, every building it has helped to finance, every family that has moved into an affordable unit through Horizons programs, those are her work. She has been doing this for 11 years. She paused, just a pause, the kind that meant something. You have been speaking to her as though she wandered in off the street. Richard Holt looked at Claire. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her before, which is to say he looked at her, and what he found looking was a woman who was looking back at him with nothing on her face, which is a very specific thing to be on the receiving end of when you have done what he had done in the last 4 minutes in front of the people who were currently watching. He started to say something. And, said Patricia Osei with the measured precision of a woman who understood timing, since we're making introductions, she looked past Richard Holt, past Darius, still holding the badge, past the tables of quiet guests, past the bar with the bartender whose eyes had finally come back up from the counter. I believe they were about to call Mr. Webb to the stage. The microphone found the MC's voice at that exact moment, with the coincidence of timing that only occurs in very well-run events, which this one was. Ladies and gentlemen, the MC said, warm, carrying, the voice of a man who was not aware of what had happened in the last 6 minutes and who therefore had nothing to account for. We'd like to take a moment to recognize our Community Builder Award recipient for this year. Marcus Webb is the founder of Webb Construction Group, now one of the city's largest affordable housing development firms. Over the past 23 years, Marcus and his team have delivered more than 2,000 units of affordable housing across the metropolitan area. His company has been the primary construction partner on 4 of Horizon's most significant projects. In addition to his firm's contributions, Marcus has personally committed $3 million to the foundation's maintenance endowment over the next 5 years. Mr. Webb, if you would join us on stage. The applause began at the back of the room. It moved forward. Richard Holt did not move. He stood in the middle of it, and the applause moved around him like water around a stone, and the man in the canvas jacket was walking through the crowd toward the stage. Walking calmly, one large hand warm on his daughter's shoulder, guiding her gently through the tables of people, and the small woman was watching Richard Holt with that same clear expression she had put on when she first crossed the room and had not changed since. And Richard Holt was understanding something that arrived in stages, the way structural failures always arrive, first as a settling, then a crack, then the thing that the crack had been trying to say all along. He had been wrong about both of them, not one, not the other. Both, simultaneously, in the same room, at an event that both of them had, in their own ways, in ways that had nothing to do with each other but that had somehow led them to the same room on the same evening, built. The applause did not stop. If anything, it grew, and a part of it, the part at table 3 nearest to where all of this had happened, had a different quality from the rest. Not just appreciation for the man on his way to the stage, but something more specific, something directed at the moment itself, at the fact of the moment, at the small woman who was still watching, and the badge that Darius was still holding, and the very specific silence that Richard Holt was standing inside. He took one step back, then another. The color in his face had changed entirely. What the evening's drinking had put there was gone. What was underneath was not better. His 6 associates at table 9 were looking at their tablecloths. On the stage, Lily stood beside her father while the MC pressed the glass award into his hands. Marcus held it for a moment. He looked at it. Then he looked out at the room, and the room looked back at him, and he stood there in his work jacket and his boots with the dust of Chandler Street still on them, and he did not look like a man who had ended up somewhere he didn't belong. He looked like a man who had walked into a room that was in fact his, even if it had taken the room a while to understand that. 20 years ago, he said, I poured concrete on a foundation in the rain because the foreman told me we were behind schedule. I didn't know then that I'd still be pouring concrete 20 years later. Except now it's my schedule. He paused. The people who made that possible, The people who design the financing, the endowments, the structures that hold these buildings up from the inside, they're in this room tonight. You know who you are." He looked briefly in the direction of the window where Claire had been standing. She was writing in her notebook. She did not look up. She did, however, turn slightly, so that her shoulder was angled toward the stage, and the pen stopped moving. It was a small thing. No one else would have noticed. The lobby emptied slowly, as hotel lobbies always do after galas. The coats retrieved, the goodbyes extended, the arithmetic of who was sharing a car with whom taking longer than anyone had anticipated. By the time Marcus came through the main doors with Lily asleep against his shoulder, one small hand still curled around the strap of her Easter dress, the circular drive outside was nearly quiet. Claire was at the top of the steps. She was standing beside one of the concrete pillars, original 1962 poor, well-maintained. Marcus noted this without deciding to. With her notebook open, writing by the light that came through the hotel's glass doors. She looked up when she heard the boots on the marble. He stopped on the step below her. The step made them approximately the same height. He shifted Lily's weight gently on his shoulder. She didn't stir. "Heavy," Claire said. "Not as much as she used to be," Marcus said. "She's growing." A pause. The city made its sounds at the edge of the drive. Somewhere down the block a taxi horn, brief and without urgency. "I'm sorry about tonight," Claire said. She was not apologizing for what Richard Holt had done. She was apologizing for the room, for the specific room that was hers, the room she had built, in which this had happened. "You don't have to be," Marcus said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Something in the exchange was direct and uncomplicated. The way things are between people who have both spent a long time being underestimated and have, each in their own way, made a kind of peace with it that does not require outside validation. "You've been funding the maintenance endowment since year 2, Claire said. "I've read every proposal you submitted." "I read your original design brief for Building 7, Marcus said. "The long-term cost modeling. I adapted the same framework for a project in the East District." He paused. "It worked." She looked at him steadily. "Did you change anything?" "The window tolerances," he said. "Northern exposures. Concrete contracts differently up there in winter. Your specs were built for a southern orientation." She considered this. Then she opened the notebook and wrote something, very quickly, in the margin, one hand holding the cover, the pen moving in the small, precise hand she used for things she didn't want to forget. She closed the notebook. Lily made a small sound and turned her face into Marcus's neck. He adjusted his grip on her the way you adjust to the weight of something familiar, without thinking about it. "She held on long," Claire said. "Through all of it." "She always holds on long," Marcus said. "She doesn't let things go easily." "She gets that honestly," Claire said. Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, the precursor to one, the signal of a man who smiles rarely but is currently close to it. "You stepped forward tonight," he said. She looked at the city beyond the drive, at the office towers with their lit windows and their hidden steel and their 40-year lifespans if the maintenance was right. "It was the right thing," she said. "That's all." He nodded once. He moved toward the steps. Then he stopped, not yet turning all the way around. "Dr. Song," she looked back. "Building 17, he said. "I'd like to be involved from the foundation up, before the concrete." She held his gaze for exactly that second. The calibrating second, the one that was not hesitation. "I'll send you the brief," she said. He nodded. He carried his daughter down the steps and across the drive to a dark pickup with a Webb Construction Group magnet on the door. The kind of truck that belonged on a job site and not outside a hotel like this. And Marcus Webb did not look like a man who had brought the wrong vehicle. He looked like a man who had somewhere to be. Claire watched the taillights go. Then she opened her notebook. She wrote 3 words. She closed it, put it in her pocket, and went back inside to thank the staff. Power has never required announcement. The buildings that have stood for a century were not the ones that told you how much weight they could hold. They were the ones that simply held it, in silence, through weather and time and the slow accumulation of all the things that press down on structures and people alike. And the people who move through the world quietly, the ones who are mistaken for background, who are handed directions to rooms they own, who are asked if they need help finding events they founded, who are told to use the service entrance when they built the building. Those people know something that the rooms are still learning, that the measure of a person has never been the volume at which they are recognized, that the ones who are most underestimated are sometimes the ones who have simply never needed anyone else to know what they know about themselves. That dignity is not something a room can give you, and it is not something a room can take away. Nobody was watching the small woman near the window. That was their first mistake, and the man in the work jacket walked in from a job site carrying his daughter and 23 years of buildings, and nobody thought to look twice. That was their second. The rest of the evening was just the world catching up. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs it. And subscribe, there are more stories like this one waiting.